India is home to some of the world's oldest crafts and traditions. Liquor made from stomped cashew fruit dates back to the 1500s. And a 2,500-year-old mud wrestling sport requires a lifetime of training. We travelled around India to see how people are keeping 14 ancient traditions alive.
Fighting in mud, training for hours, and going years without seeing family. This is kushti, a traditional form of Indian wrestling.
ऐसा है कि मतलब जैसे देखो रेसलर बनने के लिए पूरा मतलब सारा कुछ त्यागना पड़ता है.
Mauli Shamdade left his rural hometown when he was 15 to join this academy in Kolhapur. Today, he lives and trains at the century-old Gangavesh Talim. This sport is a way out of poverty for many farming families. In just over a decade, Mauli has become one of the top fighters here, earning up to $4,000 from one competition. But India has shifted to favor wrestling on the mat over mud, and the tradition that goes back 2,500 years is dwindling. So what does it take to be one of India's mud wrestlers? And how is this traditional sport still standing? Becoming a kushti fighter is all about discipline. Mauli wakes up at 3:55 a.m. every day. He starts his training sessions at dawn with some of the other 200 wrestlers who live here. They use their own and each other's body weight to build strength.
क्यों सारा कुछ लगा के सारी मतलब हर चीज़ की जान लगा के मतलब प्रैक्टिस भी करनी पड़ती है और हर चीज़ मतलब जान लगा के कुश्ती करनी पड़ती है.
They train 6 days a week, often under coach Vishwas Hargule. Mauli has been working with him since he joined the academy.
मतलब सारा कुछ ध्यान रखा जैसे मतलब अपने बच्चे को ध्यान रखते ना वैसा ध्यान रखा उन्होंने मेरा.
Vishwas has trained over 1,000 kids, and he doesn't go easy on them.
उसको मतलब लाड़ प्यार से नहीं, फिर मेहनत होने के बाद उससे लाड़ प्यार करो, वो चलेगा. लेकिन मेहनत करते वक्त अगर तुम लाड़ प्यार करोगे तो बच्चा मतलब नहीं करेगा.
In the afternoon, they hit the mud pit. Wrestlers warm up by preparing the dirt floor. They clear away stones and smooth it out. The dirt is mixed with turmeric, lemon, and salt to help wrestlers' injuries heal faster. It's swapped out every couple of years and sent to smaller talims. Many see the red soil as sacred because without it, they wouldn't have a career.
इसके कारण यहाँ की मिट्टी मिल गई मतलब भाग्य खुल गया बोलते हैं.
Before a match, Mauli warms up his joints with oil and starts planning.
1-1.5 घंटा पहले जो स्टडी होती है कुश्ती की जिसके साथ कुश्ती है मतलब जैसे कि मेरा कोई अपोजिट है उसके बारे में ये क्या करता है ये कौन से दाव लगाता है मैं उस पर कौन से दाव लगाऊं.
Wrestlers cover themselves in dirt at the start of each match to create more friction between their bodies. This is just practice, so there's no winner or loser. But Mauli still gives it his all.
पहलवानों का ऐसा है कि वो उसकी मंजिल कभी पूरी नहीं हुई.
The goal is to pin the opponent's shoulders to the soil. They use moves similar to other forms of wrestling, like locks and throws. Mauli and his opponent reapply the soil as they sweat to get a better grip. With their feet planted in the dirt, wrestlers move slowly. A real match can last as long as 1 hour. By the end, they're soaked in mud.
कुछ नहीं ऐसा ना वो तो बढ़िया फील होता है क्योंकि हम आदत सी है मिट्टी की तो कुछ नहीं लगता ऐसे तो बढ़िया लगती है.
Moulin isn't done for the day when the practice match is over.
बॉडी तो पूरी थकी हुई है लेकिन अभी भी बाकी है थोड़ा सा वर्कआउट वो पूरा करेंगे.
Mud wrestling has roots that date back to at least the 5th century BC. It evolved out of an ancient form of Indian wrestling, mixed with Persian martial arts. The sport thrived in Kolhapur at the turn of the 20th century. The district's ruler, Shahu Maharaj, was a fan of the art and built talims all over the region, including this one. But mud fighting saw a shift about 15 years ago, when India started prioritizing mat wrestling. The government wanted its athletes to compete internationally, so many talims had to adapt and started investing in mats, including this one.
कैसे है मैट और मट्टी मैट पे तो ज़रूरी ही है मतलब इस वक्त में मैट पे ज़रूरी है क्योंकि मैट पे करोगे तुम ओलंपिक तक जा सकते हो.
But here they still practice in the traditional mud pits because they believe it makes them better wrestlers on the mat too.
कैसा है कि आज मतलब हर गेम में कुछ ना कुछ चेंज होता ही रहता है तो जो पहले वाला अपना है वो रखना ही चाहिए.
Mud wrestling competitions, called dangals, still draw crowds in Kolhapur. And they always open with a ceremony, playing traditional Indian horns and drums. The cash prizes for this tournament depend on how much money the dangal organizers were able to raise from local fans. Young wrestlers take home just a small part of the pool, sometimes around $1 per win. But older, more experienced fighters can walk away with up to $1,000. That's why low-income families often send their kids to live at talims, hoping they'll get good enough to make a living. Fighters also live and train for free, but there's little comfort. Most of them sleep in shared dorms that can fit up to 50 people at a time. And with packed schedules every day, they rarely get the chance to visit home. Moulin has gone up to 4 years without seeing his family.
कि घर वालों की याद आएगी मैं घर चला जाऊंगा तो मेरा वो टारगेट जो बना हुआ है वो पूरा नहीं होगा.
But the wrestlers find family in each other.
घर वालों की तरह जैसे भाई भाई रहते ना वैसे रहते हम सारे यहाँ पे क्योंकि जैसे एक घर ही है हमारा ये सारा पूरा कंपटीशन के टाइम कंपटीशन बाकी टाइम हम एक भाई के जैसे रहते हैं सारे लोग.
Mauli's dedication has paid off. He says he earns up to $55,000 in a 4-month season. It would take a typical farming family over 35 years to make that much. Getting to that level takes a lot of time and practice, which is why kids start young.
यहाँ रेसलिंग ऐसी है कि बड़ी उम्र में नहीं हो सकती.
Some of the youngest are here for just the summer, so the talim is especially crowded this time of year. But during the height of the pandemic, it looked completely different. Wrestlers couldn't make any money for 2 years when competition stopped.
मतलब उस टाइम तो ऐसा लग रहा था कि पहलवानी ख़त्म हो जाएगी क्योंकि जो गरीब घर के बच्चे थे उनके पास पैसा नहीं था वो तो मतलब अखाड़ा छोड़ चले गए थे और उस टाइम सारे अखाड़े बंद थे.
Wrestlers are responsible for their own food and expenses, and those costs can add up, especially with the diets they have to maintain.
जितना प्रोटीन बॉडी को मिलेगा वो बॉडी उतनी आगे प्रैक्टिस के लिए ये देगी सपोर्ट देगी.
Most days they eat chicken, lamb, and eggs. But today is Saturday, so they're making vegetarian dal.
क्योंकि शनिवार हमारे यहाँ पे मतलब हनुमान जी का मानते हैं उसका व्रत भी रखते हैं शनिवार को इसके कारण वो शनिवार नहीं खाते हम.
Moulin is now a veteran at this talim, mentoring the younger wrestlers. But he still remembers his first day here.
वहाँ बहुत कंपटीशन था बहुत मतलब आगे बहुत सारे पहलवान थे मेरे आगे बहुत बड़े बड़े पहलवान थे उनको देख के ही मुझे मतलब मैं बनने की ये हो गया.
Now he's treated like a celebrity.
और मिट्टी वालों पहलवानों को ही पसंद करती है और उनको ही पहचानती है ज़्यादा. बढ़िया लगता है क्योंकि जो मैंने प्रैक्टिस की है वर्जिश की है उसका ये हो गया लगता है ऐसे.
Moulin hopes to keep wrestling for another decade, and he believes the ancient tradition of kushti isn't going anywhere.
नहीं तो मतलब जैसे पुरान मतलब जैसे पहले से ही मिट्टी वाली कुश्ती है और बहुत देर तक मिट्टी वाली कुश्ती चलेगी।
Fresh roses are the main ingredient for this ancient way of making perfume. The tradition is thousands of years old, and this small city in India is one of the only places that still makes it this way. One batch can take weeks or even months to prepare. The result is 100% pure perfume, also called attar, the Arabic word for fragrance. But what makes the attar so special is also what is leading to its demise. The time-consuming process is hard to sustain. We visited India's perfume capital, Kanauj, to see how this craft is still standing. Workers gather roses in these fields near Kanauj and deliver them to distilleries while they're still fresh. This one is over 100 years old. It's owned by ML Ramnarayan Perfumers. There is no electricity and no industrial machinery here. Workers have already prepped these copper containers or degs, filling them with just the right amount of water, about 80 kilos.
सबसे मुश्किल तो यही चीज़ है कि हमको कितना पानी लेना है। सबसे मुश्किल यही चीज़ होती है, हर आदमी अंदाज नहीं लगा पाता है।
Once the flowers arrive, they are carefully weighed. It is an essential part of the process, as getting an accurate ratio is key.
हमें लगभग 5 वर्ष लगे इस काम को सीखने के लिए।
The roses are evenly spread out, and it takes 2 men to carry and pour them into the degs. As the petals begin to seep in the water, a craftsman seals the container rim with a mixture of clay and cotton. They then light firewood inside an earthen oven called a bhatti, and the alchemy begins. The heat boils the water and flowers until they emit steam. It condenses as it travels through this hollow bamboo pipe or changa. That connects to the bhabka, a smaller container filled with sandalwood oil that forms the base of attar.
ये लोग भक्के जोड़ रहे हैं और ये जैसे पट्टी ढीली हो जाती है, जैसे टाइट बनी रहे, तो ये भक्के जो है मतलब पानी जो है बफा ना जाए।
This is where every last drop of fragrant water will gather over 6 hours. In the meantime, workers constantly check the temperatures of the different vessels, using their hands and years of experience instead of thermometers. They monitor the fire to make sure the degs are warm enough to create steam, but not too much, otherwise it can destroy the scent. They also have to make sure the bhabka stays cool enough to turn the steam back into liquid.
This is a job which requires a lot of patience, it requires a lot of time and effort. The input has to be good to get great outcomes. So every stage of our process has to be given a lot of focus and to be done with a lot of concentration, and any slip off can have negative results.
And the result is the all natural attar, free from any alcohol or artificial chemicals, with a scent that can linger for days. Here, they make over 15 different kinds of oils. But one of their most prized is mitti attar, literally meaning earth perfume.
When, let's say, there is rain on dry, parched earth, and the smell, the sweet, soothing smell that one gets. So that's the smell that you can expect from attar mitti.
To recreate the smell of earth, they use old clay pots that were used for spices or tea. They crush the pots and add them to the water just as they did with the roses. But while rose attar is made in a day, others can take weeks or even months to produce. They are distilled and redistilled till the smell is potent enough. The last step is the bottling process. It's also old school. Using a funnel and a bucket, every tiny bottle is filled by hand. Expensive attars can sell for 10,000 Indian rupees or $135. And that's the price for just 2 teaspoons of it. The raw materials are costly,
and it takes a lot to make just a little amount of perfume.
ये इतने महंगे इसलिए बिकते हैं कि जैसे आप संदल चंदन का तेल ओनली 1 लाख रुपए से नीचे नहीं बिकता, ऊपर ही बिकता है। तो हम इस पे फूल लगाएंगे 50 रुपए किलो या 200-250 रुपए किलो वाला, तो ऑटोमेटिक उसका रेंज बढ़ जाएगा।
Kanauj has been known to produce attar for at least 400 years.
As a matter of fact, Kannauj has got the geographical indication for an attar. So, technically, an attar can only be from Kannauj.
But the method of steam distilling is said to have originated in ancient Persia and the Middle East, thousands of years ago. In India, it was popularized by Mughal kings during the 17th century. But these days, young brand-conscious Indians mostly use Western perfumes. As a result, in the last 20 years, 80% of India's traditional distilleries have closed down, and the people of Kannauj have felt the decline.
So the whole town is involved in the business of perfumery. I would say about 80% to 85% of the people living in the industry, in the town, are associated to the perfume industry in one way or the other. A lot of people say that it's losing its sheen and stuff like that, but we personally don't feel that way. Every day we strive to innovate and find a new application for our oils. So we've seen growth, no doubt.
Muslims all across South Asia have used attar for centuries. It's believed to be one of Prophet Muhammad's most prized possessions.
तो हमारे दादा, हमारे डैडी सब बहुत शुरू से लगाते हुए आ रहे हैं।
And outside of India, these chemical-free attars are popular in the Middle East. European fragrance houses have also been importing attar to use it as an ingredient in their modern perfumes, breathing new life into an ancient industry.
We are very proud of our lineage, but at the same time it's a lot of responsibility as well. When you have to maintain and sustain certain standards, then that becomes difficult. It makes us proud to carry forward a legacy of 5 generations.
After all, recreating the smell of rain on earth is no small legacy.
Juice from cashew fruit is the one ingredient in Feni, a rare liquor made only in this part of the world. This family is one of the few still using techniques that date back to the 1500s. While some brands are pushing to bring Feni to the mainstream, these farmers found a way to stay in business by hand-making small batches and selling locally. We visited Goa, India, to see how this centuries-old tradition is still standing. The Gaunkar family searches their land for fallen fruits every morning. The fruits fall when they're ripe. They use a wooden stick with a needle at the end to pick up each cashew fruit. Drupati Gaunkar is the matriarch of the 100-year-old family operation. She's been making Feni for 60 years and took over the business after her husband passed away.
आता मागे सऱ्या वयता थंयसर लोक कोणालो बरो अमकेलो सोरो बरो ती आजून बरो काडटा सोरो अशें म्हणटा आनी लोक खबर आसलेलो येता सगलो.
During Feni season, from March to April, her children and grandchildren help out. After filling around 8 buckets in an hour, they take out the seeds. One by one, the family separates the cashew fruit from the cashew nut. They sell the raw cashews to factories that roast and package them. Then it's time to juice. Santosh Gaunkar puts on mining boots. The hard soles get more juice out of the fruits. He grew up helping his mother on the farm and has been doing this full-time for 25 years.
मेरे अंदाज से वो पूरा पहले से स्टार्ट हुआ लगता है मेरे को.
Little by little, he stomps away. The family used to use a big wooden stick for this step, but they eventually found that stomping with their feet was more effective. It can get slippery, so Santosh holds on tight for balance. Juicing a full vat of cashew apples takes about an hour. And in the 100-degree heat, it can be exhausting.
मेहनत का काम है, लेकिन आदमी मेहनत किया ना और थोड़ा फ्रेश रहता है बाद में, और थोड़ा नींद भी अच्छा आता है रात शाम को.
During breaks, they get fresh cashew fruit juice that you can't find in stores. It has a shelf life of just 1 day. Then, Santosh piles the last bits of fruit into a mound. He wraps it with a rope and drags a few rocks on top to squeeze out every last drop of juice. They leave the fruits like this overnight. Machines would speed up this process, but it's not an option for this family.
लोग मशीन नहीं ला सकते हैं ना, और हम लोग को गरीब का ऐसा, हम लोग को ऐसा पाँव से ये करता है.
Plus, Santosh says handmade Feni tastes better.
इसमें मशीन में डालने के टाइम वो क्या उसमें पतरे का है लगता है, जंग लगता है. वो जंग लगे ना, उसका ये स्माइल पतरे का उसमें दारू में इसमें रस में मिलता है, और इसमें हम लोग पाँव में क्या आता है वो फ्रेश आता है.
They throw away the fruit waste or give it to farmers to use as cattle feed. Bucket by bucket, they filter out any pulp fibers through a cloth. Then, the juice sits to ferment for 2 or 3 days. They transfer it into a copper drum. Meanwhile, Drupati prepares to seal the drum by dousing a piece of cloth in mud. The mud comes from nearby ant hills. The ants and snakes that live in these mounds refine the soil, which makes it better for sealing the tanks.
तो इसमें पत्थर ज़्यादा यूज़ नहीं होता है, ज़्यादा होता नहीं, तो लेता नहीं, खाली मट्टी रहता है.
Drupati wraps the clay-covered cloth around the openings to ensure no air escapes. She lights a fire to heat the juice, using wood harvested from their land. It burns for around 8 hours. Steam passes through the pipe and into a tank filled with water. It cools down the vapor, and a slow stream of arak comes out the other end. Arak is a less alcoholic beverage that the family sells when there's demand. Otherwise, they put it back into the copper pot and distill it for another 7 to 8 hours. Once it reaches the right temperature, it's Feni, with 40 to 45% alcohol. They also test it by looking at the bubbles, which should be big and spread apart slowly. The family learned this through decades of experience and close observation.
ये फेनी का मतलब क्या है, उसमें प्रोसेस है कि प्योर रहता है. वो दूसरा क्या दारू निकाल दो, उसमें कुछ केमिकल ये सब मिक्स करता है.
They make 175 liters of Feni every season and usually sell all of it to local buyers. But business today looks a little different than it used to. People in nearby villages have moved to bigger cities for work, so fewer people come by to drink Feni.
येताले म्हणजे दिसा कितें तुगेले 200-300 रुपया संपूर्ण कितें येपेत जातालो, आतां ते मेले बावडे सगळे.
The family brings in around 50,000 Indian rupees, or nearly $700 in a season. And their operation probably won't be getting any bigger, since buying more land can be expensive. The government auctions off trees to the highest bidder.
पहले क्या गरीब लोग के पास अब पैसा नहीं रहता ना उसको बोनी लगाने के लिए. जो पैसा रहेगा उसको बोनी मिलेगा, वही उन लोग को मिलता है. इसलिए वो लोग ज़्यादा लोग कम हो गया.
Meanwhile, other Feni makers in Goa are looking to expand the market and popularize the drink. A brand called Kazulo draws in locals and tourists with a tasting room and distillery tours.
Basically, when you step out from here, you are baptized into a new Feni drinker.
One of the tour's big attractions is the underwater aging technique. Workers have to dive in the water to pull out aged bottles of Feni.
We have Feni that has been resting for more than 2 years so that the flavors mellow down but under controlled temperature. It was an old technique used by the Georgians for wines.
Kazulo gets its Feni from local farmers who hand make it in the traditional way, just like the Gaunkar family. Some of these methods date back to at least the 1500s, when farmers in this region used to make liquor from coconut palm sap, called toddy.
Our ancestors had this thought where they said, you know what, let's innovate. Let's take an extra step ahead. You know, if we can do a distilled toddy, which has sugar, let's try distilling fruits.
After the Portuguese brought cashew trees from Brazil to Goa, at some point during the 16th century, distilling cashew Feni became more common since it was easier to produce. It's been popular throughout Goa ever since, but it hasn't been able to break out beyond state lines.
Feni comes under the country liquor category. That very notion puts you in a place saying that, you know what, it's an inferior spirit. The world outside Goa is so difficult to enter in terms of spirit. It is a great spirit with a great story and a great culture, but we've not been able to put it out. So we use chili and salt. We've been in a bubble for more than 200 years, where Feni has existed but never spoken about, and now it's time that we come out of a bubble.
For the Gaunkar family, they're not sure how much longer their business will sustain them.
इधर यही काम करके हम लोग का नहीं मिलेगा. कल बाद में वो झाड़ मर गया तो बाद में हम लोग का झाड़ कैसा, क्यों हम लोग को वही पेट भरने का काम है ना, इसलिए हम लोग को क्या है वही उसका एग्रीकल्चर करके उसका बढ़ाने का, उसका झाड़ लगाने का, वही प्रोसेस चालू करने का हम लोग का, वही इसमें हम लोग का जाता है लाइफ.
This dried out pumpkin shell will be sanded, cut, decorated, and transformed into one of the most important instruments in classical Indian music. It's called a tanpura. And for hundreds of years, craftspeople like Farooq Abdul Majid sitar maker have hand-carved them out of gourds instead of wood.
जब ये 4 तार जैसे बनेंगे तो पूरा विश्व का भंडार वो तानपुरे के उसमें से निकलता है.
His family has been making musical instruments like tanpuras and sitars for 7 generations in his hometown of Meerut. This city of over 500,000 people in western India is known as a hub for classical musicians and as the birthplace of this craft.
तानपुरा या सितार बनना म्यूजिक इंस्ट्रूमेंट मीरज में बनना बंद होगा तो मीरज को कोई पहचानने वाला नहीं होगा.
It takes at least 3 weeks to make just one, and they cost almost 3 times as much as the smaller electronic versions. We went to Meerut to find out how the art of turning pumpkin shells into instruments is still standing.
यहाँ पे अभी जो तुम्बा है उसको निकालेंगे.
Imtiaz Abdul Majid sitar maker says the secret to a Meerut tanpura is the shell of a bottle gourd. This variety is grown specially to make instruments and must be hung to dry and harden for a year. He soaks it in water for up to 2 days and scrapes it clean inside and out.
भिगोने के बाद कैसा है, ये जो अभी जो हार्ड है इसमें तो एकदम जैसा रबर जैसा रहता है, भिगोने के बाद उस तरह से होता है वो.
Imtiaz started this job when he was just 13 years old. Now, at 44, he works alongside 7 family members, hand-making tanpuras and sitars. He cuts the shell about a quarter of the way in and scrapes out any debris left over. This will become the tumba, the body of the tanpura. Wood will make up other parts of the instrument, like the soundboard and the neck. Ensuring its good quality is crucial. They season it for 3 years to strengthen it. They take their time crafting the wood, sawing, carving, and filing it down.
फिर रहता है और ये पूरा हाथ पे है, मशीन से तो ये काम नहीं बनता कोई.
Shaping the pieces alone can take up to 12 days. but after 31 years, woodwork has become Imtiaz's specialty. He prepares the top of the tumba for the neck joint, known as the gullu. It connects the tumba to the rest of the instrument and must be fitted perfectly to ensure the best sound. He uses bamboo nails that he makes himself. He says they merge well with the tumba and give a more finished look. These sticks of wood preserve the tumba's shape as it dries for 2 to 3 days depending on how sunny it is.
जैसे कि तबली जिस तरह से चाहिए उस तरह से इसको फिटिंग बनाएं.
To make the tabli or the soundboard, Imtiaz traces the shape of the hollow tumba onto a piece of wood and cuts it out. He spends a day carving and shaping the tabli.
लेकिन जो भी है हमारे नज़र पे काम चलता है. नज़र पे जो भी होगा काम परफेक्ट बनना चाहिए ना.
It takes at least a day to make the neck of the tanpura, known as the dand. Imtiaz uses a block plane to hollow out a 40-inch piece of wood. He assembles the tanpura and glues the pieces with wood adhesive and taps to check the sound.
अभी ये आवाज़ है. यहाँ पे ब्रिज आएगा. यहाँ से आवाज़ आएगी. यहाँ से आवाज़ आएगी. इसमें भी आवाज़ परफेक्ट आना चाहिए. यहाँ भी आना चाहिए.
Then Imtiaz hands it over to his uncle Farooq.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम.
वालेकुम सलाम.
क्या इम्तियाज़ क्या चले?
अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह.
He's been designing the family's instruments for over 40 years. And it's a group effort. 8 of his relatives work together to preserve the legacy.
वो उस तरह पहले रफ करेंगे, फिर वो जैसे आँखियों को चुभेगा, अच्छा दिखेगा, तो फिर ठीक है. ऐसे फिर हमारे जो बड़े भाई हैं उनसे बातचीत करके बाबा ऐसे ऐसा ये पैटर्न अपने को यहाँ पर करना है, तो ये अच्छा दिखेगा क्या नहीं दिखेगा, तो बोलेगा अच्छा दिखता है बनाएंगे, तो वो भी सजेशन उनसे ले लेते हैं.
They spend hours carving peacocks, flowers and vines out of wood and strips of white plastic.
देखो अभी इस काम में थोड़ा क्या है, हाथ काम करने की वजह से हाथ एकदम सख्त हो जाते हैं, मुलायम नहीं रहते हैं, क्योंकि छन्नियाँ और हथौड़ा का थोड़ा हेवी होने की वजह से हर यानी जो हाथ का जो एरिया होता है वो सब सख्त हो जाता है.
In the past, they used ivory, but the Indian government banned the use of it in the late 80s. Farooq mixes coal dust with wood glue to make the black coloring. Polishing brings it all together, but it comes at a price.
कुछ लोगों का साइड इफेक्ट है. ये साइड इफेक्ट होने से उनके जो हाथ होते हैं थोड़े गल जाते हैं, यानी जख्मा वगैरह होते हैं.
He adds a natural resin called gum copal as a final layer and scrapes off any excess polish. It can take up to 3 weeks to make one tanpura. And the family's techniques haven't changed in almost 200 years. If anyone asks Farooq what he does, all he has to say is his last name. The name sitar maker is used by the instrument-making descendants of the man credited for introducing the pumpkin tanpura. Some say the idea to use pumpkins as instruments came to Farid Sahib sitar maker in 1850, after seeing Hindu monks use the shells to store water. Some say it came from seeing African ships use them to transport jars of honey. While other parts of India made the tanpura with jackwood, Farid found the pumpkin gave it a stronger vibration and better sound. The instrument became a staple for classical singers throughout India in the late 19th century. And its popularity put Meerut on the map as home to the best handcrafted instruments. But when electronic tanpuras hit the market in 1979, demand for the handmade ones dwindled. The family now sells only half of what they used to 25 years ago.
आज के लोकेशन में, आज के पीरियड में हम साल में 100 से 125 सितारे या तानपुरे बना लेते हैं.
every piece of Farouk's is made with precision.
तो हमारा सिर्फ एक उद्देश्य है, मकसद है कि अच्छे साज बने और इसकी फैला यानी रोशनी हो जाए.
He drills 4 holes to the top of the dand. This is where the pegs will go.
इससे मार्किंग में जब गलती हो जाती है तो इससे तार टूटने का संभव होता है.
The strings are made of Japanese steel that he buys from a market in Mumbai. He threads them through these small beads called manka. They're used to fine-tune the instrument.
जब तानपुरा पूरा तैयार हो जाता है, तब उसको तार और खूंटियाँ बैठती हैं, तब जब ब्रिज रखने का उस पर जो परेड आता है, तब हमें मन में शांति करेंगे कि तानपुरा जट से अच्छा बोले.
The bridge made of camel bone supports the strings. These cotton threads called javari help enrich the sound. It takes artisans years to master tuning a tanpura. Simple factors like room temperature and humidity can affect the sound. So craftsmen must have a trained ear. Farouk sits for 3 hours, tightening and loosening the strings until they sound flawless.
जब ऐसे लगता है कि चलो अभी ये अपने लिए परफेक्ट हुआ, पूरा परिपक्व हुआ है, अब हमें इसे अपने ग्राहक के हाथ में देना चाहिए, हम मुनासिब समझेंगे.
The sitar maker's reputation for high-quality handmade instruments has helped them stay afloat. It's why singers like Subhadra Desai still use the tanpuras made by them.
आप किसी भी आर्टिस्ट को पूछ लीजिए, गायक को, वो मेरठ से ही तानपुरा मंगवाते हैं. एक परंपरा बनी हुई है कि वो उस तरह से ही बनाएंगे तानपुरे.
She has been practicing Hindustani classical music for over 4 decades. When she was just 13 years old, she got her first tanpura, which was made by Farouk's family.
तानपुरे क्या होते हैं कि ये ना अपने बच्चे जैसे होते हैं. उसके लिए जितना प्यार होता है ना बच्चे के लिए, तानपुरे के लिए गायक को उतना प्यार होता है.
The industry is facing competition from electronic tanpuras and phone apps. But Subhadra says that while digital options may be practical, they do not match the authentic tones of the original.
वो कान में जब तक देखो तानपुरे को, जब हम तार को ऐसे बजा रहे हैं तो ये तार हिल रहा है, तो उसका जो वाइब्रेशन जब तक आ रहा है, वो वाइब्रेशन आपको अपने गले से जो आप स्वर निकाल रहे हैं उसके साथ मर्ज करने में वो मददगार होता है. वो यहाँ पे सीधे आ रहा है, इसको इधर तो नहीं रख सकते.
She performs throughout India and teaches music at universities. Many of her students still use tanpuras made in Meerut. A fully decorated tanpura can cost up to 33,000 rupees or around $400.
डेकोरेशन सिर्फ जो हमारे जो ग्राहक हैं, कस्टमर हैं, उनको जो है सिंपल डेकोरेटेड का ज़्यादा लगता है, क्योंकि ये मामला जो है पैसों का मामला है.
They make about 6 to 8 tanpuras a month and split the profits among themselves.
और एक काम में मेहनत ज़्यादा होने के वजह से मुनाफा कम है.
They worry that apathy and modern alternatives may render the family business obsolete. But their deep love for music has helped them carry on the family's legacy.
हमारे भगवान से अब ऐसी प्रार्थना है कि ये कारोबार फूले और फले, ताकि संगीत का विश्व में भंडार हो.
The secret to making this sacred mirror is known by just a handful of people. Aranmula Kannadi is made entirely from metal, and the formula for the special reflective alloy has been passed down in this community in India for around 500 years. The process is incredibly labor-intensive and done entirely by hand. It's all to get a reflection that gives zero distortion, and the mirror is believed to bring good luck. Sudhamal Jay learned the trade secrets from her father when she was little, so when he died, she chose to defy cultural taboos and take on the business.
പിന്നെ ഏത് സ്ത്രീകൾക്കും ഇത് എത്ര ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ള ജോലിയായാലും ചെയ്യാൻ സാധിക്കുമെന്നുള്ളതിൻ്റെ ഒരു തെളിവും കൂടിയാണ്.
She's carried the business through a devastating flood and the pandemic. So what makes this mirror so unique? And how is this centuries-old craft still standing? Aranmula Kannadi gets its name from its birthplace, a district in Kerala known for its rich culture, and for its temple, where the mirror was born. Originally, only royals and priests could use the mirror for rituals. Today, it's more accessible, but the social and spiritual importance still remains, and so does the age-old process.
സാധാരണ ഗ്ലാസ് മിററും ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടിയും തമ്മിലുള്ള വ്യത്യാസം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ നമ്മൾ ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടി ആദ്യം മുതലേ നമ്മൾ ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡ് കൈകൊണ്ട് തന്നെയാണ് അതിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ വർക്കുകളും ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഒരു മെഷീനറിയും നമ്മൾ ഇവിടെ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നില്ല.
Sudhamal works with her son Niranjan, often into the night. They're melting down the raw metals that they'll need for tomorrow's batch of mirrors. An old roof tile makes the perfect mold. Niranjan seals the end of it so that the molten metal won't leak out. The mirror's alloy is made of tin and copper. They're melted down separately and poured into different molds. The next day, the tin and copper rods will be broken up and melted down together in the perfect ratio to create the mirror's reflective surface. Sudhamal starts the day by making the clay. It'll be used to build the mold for the mirror. She crushes up leftover pottery into a fine powder. Another ingredient is jute, a fiber they take from grocery bags. She mixes the jute and the pottery dust with mud that she harvested from a nearby paddy field. A little water loosens up the mixture, so she can knead it until it reaches the right consistency. Sudhamal is doing the kind of physical work that's typically done by men in this industry.
ആദ്യമായിട്ട് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻ്റ് ആയിട്ട് ഈ തൊഴിൽ ചെയ്യുന്ന ആദ്യത്തെ ഒരു വനിതയാണെന്നുള്ളതിൽ എനിക്ക് അഭിമാനമുണ്ട്.
Her father became sick in 2007, and his dying wish was for someone to carry on his legacy. Since he had no sons, he left the secrets with his wife and daughter.
ഈ തൊഴിലിനെ മുന്നോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുപോകണം, നമ്മുടെ കുടുംബത്തെ ഒരു ജോലിയല്ലേ, അത് നിലനിർത്തിക്കൊണ്ട് പോകണം എന്ന് എല്ലാവരും സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്തിട്ടേ ഉള്ളൂ.
Sudhamal's mother, Punamal, is in charge of packing the clay into circular molds. The discs dry outside anywhere from 1 to 4 days, depending on how sunny it is. Once they're dried and smoothed out, Sudhamal coats the discs with wet charcoal. The charcoal fills in the disc's tiny pores, so that the mirror will come out smoothed after it's sandwiched between the two discs. Niranjan puts tiny pieces of metal on one disc before placing the other one on top. This creates a space that the molten metal will later fill. He layers on more clay until the mold is completely sealed. Niranjan learned how to make mirrors from his grandfather when he was a kid. He came back to the craft after getting a business degree.
എൻ്റെ അപ്പൂപ്പൻ്റെ മരണശേഷമാണ് ഇതിൽ കൂടുതലും ശ്രദ്ധിക്കാൻ തുടങ്ങിയത്. അമ്മയെ സഹായിക്കാനും അപ്പോൾ കൂടുതൽ അതിനോടുള്ള ആഗ്രഹം വന്നു, അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്തു തുടങ്ങി.
This kind of passion for this work is not common for someone his age.
ആളുകൾ ഈ ക്രാഫ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ മടിക്കുന്നവരുമുണ്ട്. അത് ഇത് ചെയ്യാനുള്ള പാടും ചൂടത്തുള്ള നിർമ്മാണ രീതികളും ഒക്കെ ആയിരിക്കാം.
While the crucible dries out, Niranjan breaks up the tin and copper rods that he cast the day before. Only the people who have inherited this craft know just how much of each metal to add to the crucible.
ഈ നിർമ്മാണ മേഖലയിലുള്ള ഒരു സൊസൈറ്റി ഉണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു നിയമം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് നമ്മൾ ഇതിൻ്റെ സീക്രട്ട് രഹസ്യങ്ങൾ പ്രോസസ്സിൻ്റെ എല്ലാ രഹസ്യങ്ങളും അങ്ങനെ പുറത്ത് ആർക്കും പറഞ്ഞു കൊടുക്കാറില്ല. അതേ കുടുംബങ്ങളിലെ തന്നെ കുട്ടികൾക്ക് കൈമാറിയാണ് വരുന്നത്.
Legend has it that at least 300 years ago, the formula for reflective metal came to a village elder in a dream. Another story says that metalworkers accidentally discovered the alloy while making a crown for the king. The knowledge has been passed down in mirror-making families ever since. But that legacy almost came to an end for Sudhamal's family, when floods wiped out nearly their entire stock in 2018. It was the worst flooding the state of Kerala had seen in a century. Sudhamal and her family were among 1 million people who were forced to flee. After the floods, they came home to corroded tools and broken mirrors, totaling up to $17,000 worth of damage.
ആറന്മുള കണ്ണാടിയുമായിട്ട് ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട എല്ലാ നിർമ്മാണ എക്യുപ്മെൻറ്റ്സും എല്ലാം ലോസായി.
Not long after they got back to regular business, the pandemic hit. They didn't receive any orders for 8 months.
അതുപോലെ എല്ലാ യൂണിറ്റിനും സാമ്പത്തിക ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുകളുണ്ട് നന്നായിട്ട്.
Sudhamal and Niranjan can't afford to hire anyone right now, so they have to put in double the work. Much of their 10-hour workday is spent tending to the fire. Niranjan feeds it with charcoal and coconut husks, while Sudhamal cranks the fan.
ഏറ്റവും നമുക്ക് ആ ചൂട് ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ള ചൂട് തന്നെയാണ്.
The crucibles sit in the 1200-degree fire for about an hour, with the metal pieces at the bottom. Then Niranjan checks to see if the metal is melted by listening carefully for a sound. He cools down the hot crucible with his bare hands and a little bit of wet clay. Then he slowly flips it. That makes the molten metal inside trickle down and fill the space between the discs.
അങ്ങനെ ഒരു പീസായിട്ടല്ല ഒരു എണ്ണമായിട്ടല്ല നമ്മൾ നിർമ്മിക്കാറുള്ളത്. ഒരു ബൾക്കായിട്ട് 10 പീസ് അല്ല 20 പീസൊക്കെ എടുത്തിട്ടാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്.
To double check that it worked, he cracks open the top of each one. If there's a little metal left over, that means the mirror was successfully forged. But things don't always go according to plan. Sometimes the metal leaks out and doesn't form the mirror. But they always make sure to recycle leftover pieces back into the process. The next day, it's time for the reveal. The mirror isn't reflective just yet. It needs to go through several rounds of polishing. But first, Sudhamal cuts it down. The size will determine the price. These mirrors range anywhere from $20 to $1,300. Their most popular kind is a handheld mirror called Valkanadi. It's the same one that was used by royals. And today it's often gifted for housewarmings and weddings. The brass frame is made entirely by hand too, using a sand casting process. They make big batches of these frames a couple times a year. And the designs are all hand chiseled.
95% ഹാൻഡ്മെയ്ഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ തന്നെയാണ് ആഗ്രഹം. കൂടുതൽ ആളുകൾ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നത് ഹാൻഡ്മെയ്ഡായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രൊഡക്ട്സാണ്. സോ മെഷീൻ യൂസുള്ള പ്രൊഡക്ട്സ് ആരും ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടാൻ താല്പര്യമില്ല എന്നാണ് എൻ്റെ വിശ്വാസം.
Sudhamal uses wet sandpaper to smooth the mirror's surface. She applies a few drops of coconut oil to polish it. And then she finally places the mirror inside the brass frame, using a homemade adhesive.
പിന്നെ പണ്ട് കാലം മുതലേ മണലും മെഴുകും ചെഞ്ചലും ഒരു പ്രത്യേക അനുപാതത്തിൽ ഉരുക്കിയെടുത്ത ആ മിശ്രിതത്തെ മണലുമായിട്ട് ചേർത്താണ് ഒരു അരക്കുണ്ടാക്കുകയും.
Sudhamal gives it a few more rounds of polishing with more coconut oil and a velvet cloth. They always put a sticker on the back of the frame to mark its authenticity. It's a crucial step, since counterfeit Aranmula kannadis take up a huge part of the market. That's why the Indian government gave artisans exclusive rights to make these only in Aranmula back in 2005. And with a good eye, you can tell the difference between a real and a fake.
അതേപോലെ തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ പിന്നെ പ്രതിബിംബം യഥാർത്ഥ പ്രതിബിംബമാണ് അതിൽ കാണുന്നത്.
Typical glass mirrors reflect light through the back of the mirror, which can create distortion. and Aranmula Kannadi reflects light on the surface of the metal, so it's believed to show a more accurate reflection.
മിറർ അവസാനമായിട്ട് പോളിഷ് ചെയ്ത് നമ്മൾ എടുക്കുന്ന ഉടനെ അതിൽ നമ്മുടെ മുഖം നോക്കുമ്പോൾ അത് ഒരു സന്തോഷവും സംതൃപ്തിയുള്ള ഒരു തരുന്നതായിരുന്നു ഏറ്റവും ഇഷ്ടം.
And even though the traditional process is taxing, it's part of their ancestry.
മെഷീൻ യൂസ് ചെയ്ത് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ക്രാഫ്റ്റും ഹാൻഡ് മെയ്ഡായിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ക്രാഫ്റ്റും തമ്മിൽ കുറേ വ്യത്യാസമുണ്ട്.
Sudhamal hopes the next wave of mirror makers will see that too.
പുതിയ തലമുറ അങ്ങനെ ഗിഫ്റ്റ് വാങ്ങിക്കാൻ താല്പര്യപ്പെടുന്നില്ല എന്ന് പറയുന്നെങ്കിലും എനിക്ക് പറയാനുള്ളത് നമ്മുടെ പാരമ്പര്യമായിട്ടുള്ളതും ഉള്ള ക്രാഫ്റ്റിനെ അതുപോലെ ആർട്ടിനെ ഒക്കെ പുതിയ തലമുറ സ്നേഹിക്കണേ.
Perfect feathers are key to a good badminton shuttlecock. 16 of them to be exact. Craftspeople in India's Jadubaria village have been making these birdies by hand for generations. The area used to be filled with over 500 small factories, like Dodo shuttles. But foreign competition and growing demand for synthetic shuttlecocks have forced many to close, and scores of workers have left to find higher-paying jobs. We visited West Bengal to see how India's shuttlecock capital is still standing. All of Dodo's shuttlecocks are made with white duck feathers. Workers like Israel Mullick wash them in small bunches in soapy water.
ছোটবেলা থেকেই এবার করছি আমি, ন্যাংটোলা থেকে হিসেবে মতো এই বাড়িতেই আছি আমি। এইখানেই বড় টড় হয়েছে, এইখানেই মানুষের মতন হয়েছে এখানে, বাস আমি এইখানে কাজটা এখানে করি।
Usually he works in the final stages of production, but today he's on washing duty. He and his co-workers scrub by the handful for several seconds. It can take workers up to an hour to get through a batch this size. Local duck meat farmers sell these feathers in bulk to the factory. Next, they rinse the bunches in water and set them aside to drip off. Israel fills his buckets with fresh water for a second rinse. He keeps one clean and dilutes a small amount of natural indigo dye in the other. This gives the feathers a very subtle tint that keeps them from yellowing. Working swiftly in tandem, they rinse, dye, and wring out handfuls at a time. Then they spread them out to dry in the sun for 3 to 4 hours.
सूख जाएगा तो फिर नेक्स्ट प्रोसेसिंग चालू होगा शटलकॉक का.
The clean and dry feathers go inside to be sorted and trimmed. This is co-owner Subodh Niyogi's favorite part of the whole process.
सिलेक्शन के ऊपर एक तो शटल का ड्यूरेबिलिटी, फ्लाइट सब कुछ मेंटेन होता है सिलेक्शन के ऊपर. घर में खाना खाएगा वो चावल रहेगा तो जो कुछ दे के खाना पड़ेगा, लेकिन चावल नहीं रहेगा खाएगा क्या, ऐसा हो.
A worker inspects each feather, looking for strength and uniformity. If one isn't up to standard, it gets discarded. Then he trims them to exactly 3 inches long. His shears are bolted together to ensure there's no variation in length. Next, a team of workers start to shape them. They take just a few seconds to cut out a curved edge on one side and a straight edge on the other. The cutters are so practiced that they don't even require a guide to churn through hundreds of identically trimmed feathers a day.
हम जो काम करते हैं हमारे पास में इजी होता है, वो जो काम करता है उसके पास इजी होता है. इजी जिसका जो काम उसका पास में उसका इजी.
Even though the Niyogis are proud to use only Indian feathers, they do import these cork bases from China. A worker drills 16 holes into each base with the only machine used at the factory. But it isn't fully automated. Someone still has to guide it into place with a steady hand and a good eye. Precision like this is also key when it comes to gluing the feathers into the base. With just a quick dab of glue, a worker aligns each feather so it overlaps with the next, occasionally checking that they're all even. And then another binds them together with thread. This forms what's called the skirt of a shuttlecock.
ये नैनल थ्रेड से होता है, नैनल थ्रेड से इसको बाइंडिंग किया जाता है ज़्यादा स्ट्रॉन्ग बनाने के लिए और ड्यूरेबिलिटी बढ़ाने के लिए.
He knots around each feather's shaft, making 2 separate rings of thread. But for an added bit of security, a worker also applies a thin coat of epoxy to the base and threads with a paintbrush. Then it's time for the finishing touches, like a label that indicates the speed of the shuttlecock, and of course, the Dodo brand. One important aspect of Israel's job is to weigh each one before packaging.
ऐसे होता है वेट. अगर वो थोड़ा वेट ज़्यादा बढ़ाना है तो ऐसे करके वेट बढ़ाते हैं.
Once they're at 70 grams, he stacks 10 of them in a tube and prepares them for sale across India. Depending on the quality, Dodo sells each tube for 200 to 300 rupees, or about $3 to $4. Production here is often done in stages, but from start to finish, a single shuttlecock takes just 30 minutes to make.
আমার হাতে ভালো মানে মেশিনে ফিনিশিং না, হাতের মধ্যে ফিনিশিং মতন হবে না, বাইরের মালের মতন মেশিনের মতো ফিনিশ হবে না. এটা দেখতে ভালো লাগে, সুন্দর, যেন একটা লোক নিতে গেলে খুব পছন্দ হয়, মালটা সুন্দর, কিন্তু মেশিনে এত ভালো হবে না.
However, this handmade approach means small places like this can't make as much product or as much profit as major global brands that use machines. This has forced many of the workers in Jadurberia out of the village's traditional industry over the past few years.
তাহলে আমাদের সব লোক চলে যাবে, বাদ চলে যাবে, আমাকে এই ফিনিশ ডিপেন্ডটা আমাদের থাকতে হবে দুজনকে. যে আমার 15 জন লেবার, তখন 2টো লেবার রাখবে মেশিন এসে গেলে, তাহলে এই কামগুলো করতে হবে, এই কাজগুলো করতে হবে.
The rise in synthetic shuttlecocks is another threat. Plastic and nylon alternatives have become more popular as they're often cheaper and last longer.
प्लास्टिक शटल तो बुढ़ा आदमी जो है वो प्लास्टिक वो माने बॉडी फिट रखने के लिए खेलता है, उसमें तो मौजा नहीं है, प्लास्टिक शटल मौजा नहीं है खेलने से.
But that's changing. In January 2020, the Badminton World Federation announced it would allow approved synthetic shuttlecocks at all levels of competition, starting in 2021. But the coronavirus pandemic has delayed widespread development and approval of them. And opinions among professional players are still mixed on how it could impact the sport. But for the workers who rely on feathered shuttlecocks, there's no substitute for the real thing.
এইটা না হলে আমরা চলবে না, এই গাড়িটা এটা আমরা আছি বলে চলছে.
Bidri art is a form of metalworking from India that hasn't changed in 600 years. The 8-step process involves molten metals, hours of chiseling, and an eye for detail. The secret ingredient? A special soil that can only be found inside a fort in the city of Bidr. But in an industry with already tight profit margins and expensive raw materials, the art form may not be around for much longer.
काम बंद होने का खतरा होता है, काम चलते आ रहा आज हमारे हाथ में.
We visited some of the last artisans who still know the craft to see how it's still standing. Bidri art begins with metal casting. An artisan uses a finished piece to make the mold. He piles sand on top and packs it as tightly as possible with the help of his body weight. Now, the mold is ready to cast a new piece. The worker melts pieces of zinc and copper over a small fire. Then he pours the molten metal into the mold. It takes about 5 minutes for the metal to cool and solidify. Then it's time to reveal the final shape.
जैसे माँ पेट में बच्चा है तो पैदा होने के बाद ही मालूम होता है वो लड़की है या लड़का है. तो जब हम मटेरियल जब पेटी के अंदर डालते हैं वो फेल हुआ या पास हुआ वो खोलने के बाद ही मालूम होता है.
Mohammed Ibrahim takes on buffing and polishing, using one of the only pieces of modern equipment in the workshop, Then he covers the piece with a copper sulfate solution. This creates a chalkboard-like surface for the artisans to sketch out a design. They begin to chisel away at the metal, following the sketch. It's the most time-consuming part of the process. Sometimes they spend an entire day chiseling. Next, the artisan hammers a silver or gold wire into the engraving. It's detailed work that takes patience and good eyesight. That's why this glasses salesman comes by the workshop every month.
नहीं लगाया तो आँख में मोतिया पर्दा व्हील बिजली काम के लिए होना जरूरी है साहब क्योंकि वो बारीक काम है.
Meanwhile, another worker welds the pieces together to form a vase. Then it goes through a few rounds of buffing, filing, and cleaning. Finally, workers boil together water, soil, and aluminum chloride. They soak the piece in the hot mud to give it the signature black color. The wire resists the coloration, so the design stands out against the dark background. The soil used in this process is what makes Bidri art unique.
ये बहुत बड़ी बात है दुनिया में ये किसी भी मिट्टी से ये कलर काला ना होता सिवाय बिदर के खिले की मिट्टी से काला होता है.
It comes from a 600-year-old fort, which is just about 3 miles away from Mohammed Salimuddin's workshop. He says a chemical used in the fort's construction gives the soil a special quality.
वो प्रोसेस के चुनने से ही जो ज़मीन पे अफेक्ट होता है मैग्नेटिक अफेक्ट हो जाता है उसके अंदर की मिट्टी से ही ये कलर ब्लैक होता है. तो चोरी छुपी से हमारे कोई एक आधा बंदा जाके तो वो एक बार थैला ला लिए तो 8-10 साल इजीली चलता है.
Mohammed says Bidri artisans have never been stopped by security. But before taking the soil, he checks the quality.
इसलिए टेस्ट करते हैं कि थोड़ी सी खारापना होता है सर. Perfect.
The fort was built by the Bahamani dynasty. They're credited with bringing metalworkers from Iran and popularizing Bidriware between the 14th and 15th centuries. The art flourished through the 1800s, when it was showcased at exhibitions in Europe. But a fall in demand towards the end of the 20th century and the rising cost of silver in the 2000s put a strain on artists' livelihoods.
पहले 400 रुपये को 10 ग्राम सिल्वर मिलता था. अब 750-800 रुपये को 10 ग्राम हो गया.
The pandemic has also raised export costs and kept tourists from visiting Bidr, slashing Mohammed's sales.
2019 में जो सेल हुई थी उसकी 10% भी इस साल सेल नहीं हुई सर. 10% भी नहीं हुई सेल. अब पता नहीं कितने साल लगेंगे हालात सुधरने के लिए इंडस्ट्री के.
Today, Mohammed says there are around 10 workshops in Bidr, but he worries they won't be around for much longer.
अब धीरे धीरे ये क्राफ्ट भी घट रही है. न्यू जनरेशन उससे जुड़ रहा नहीं तो ये आर्टिजनों की तादाद दिन ब दिन गिरते जा रही है.
Mohammed has managed to stay in business by expanding his market with online sales. He sells pieces at his brick-and-mortar shop too, just a short walk from the artisans' workshops. A vase that takes up to 3 days to make goes for 3,000 rupees, or $41. Mohammed says he purposefully prices his goods to just about break even, to keep turnover high.
ज़्यादा अगर रेट रखे तो बिकने में देरी करता है आइटम. काम चलने से मतलब बस उतनी मार्जिन रखता है सर.
The pieces that require more time and resources cost more, like this bust. It took 20 days to make, and it's selling for 60,000 rupees, or just over $800. And this plate that took nearly 2 months to make cost 200,000 rupees, or about $3,000. Hardships aside, Mohammed is happy, so long as the whole industry works together.
मैं अपने बिजनेस से सेटिस्फाई हूँ सर, लेकिन मैं चाहता हूँ कि मैं सेटिस्फाई मैं एक रहने से काम नहीं चलता. पूरी इंडस्ट्री को बिजनेस मिले. नहीं बिदरी क्राफ्ट में तो कोई कंपटीशन नहीं है सर हमारा, क्योंकि हम जो काम करते हैं पूरे इंडस्ट्री के लोग एक मिलजुल के काम आना चाहते हैं.
Pure silk is essential to making an authentic Banarasi sari. They can only be made here in the town of Varanasi, where the craft was born. Weavers use methods that go back 600 years and even add gold and silver threads to their designs. At one point, they were so expensive, only royals and the wealthiest of families could afford them. But cheap imitations made with synthetic silk have flooded the market in recent decades, forcing many weaving families out of business.
पहले हम पूरे मदनपुरा में पूरा ही बनारसी काम बनाया था. अब पूरा घूम जाओगे तो 10-12 जगह आपको मिलेगा.
So how is this centuries-old tradition still standing? To weave a Banarasi sari, a weaver first sources fine silk. It goes through a cleaning and dyeing process before it's made into thread. Dyers drape the white silk over steel rods and submerge it in tanks of boiling soap water and then rub the yarn with their hands until it's soft and bright. They give it one more wash and hang it to dry. The colors are mixed with warm water, caustic soda, and acid. They dip the roll in the mixture for 2 to 3 hours to make sure the threads are coated evenly. Dyers change colors according to the season, festival, and city. Muhammad Afzal Ansari has been working with this silk since he was 15 years old. He has preserved the traditional ways of weaving Banarasi saris, like using the khaddi, a 200-year-old wooden loom.
ये लगाव बहुत अच्छा है बनारस के लिए. ये कहीं पूरे वर्ल्ड में बनारस के नाम से जाओगे तो बनारसी साड़ी कहेंगे, जरूर देखना.
He follows designs that are punched on cardboard cards he buys from Arun Kumar. It's sort of like making a stencil. Arun uses this tool and a hammer to pierce holes in them.
ये बहुत ज़रूरी है. इससे जब तक ये नहीं होगा कुछ नहीं होगा. यहीं से स्टार्टिंग होता है काम के लिए.
Nowadays, he's so fast he can make thousands of cards in 1 week. The drawings blend Mughal, Persian, and Chinese motifs. This work is called likhai. Artists use traditional designs or invent their own. Muhammad ties all the cards together, then hangs them on the loom. But the difficult part is working with the threads. Most Banarasi saris are 6 yards long, and it takes 5,000 threads to weave a single one. And Muhammad works for 2 days to assemble them on the loom. He sprays water to preserve their elasticity and to make them softer. Now he can start weaving.
जब हाथ तो पैर से कला है. लूम वाले खाली मशीन चालू कर दी, देख लिए तो बस तो खड़े रहते देखते रहते. कुछ बिगड़ गया तो बस उसमें बना दिए. इसमें हाथ और पैर बराबर से चलता रहता है.
These golden silk threads are called zari, and that's what gives the Banarasi saris their signature look. Muhammad uses the threads in smaller spindles to create the iconic Banarasi brocades. He throws the shuttle from one end of the loom to the other to create the design. It's a tedious process that requires many years of experience to master, and Muhammad has been doing it for 40 years.
20 साल का आदमी होता तब इसी धरती फेंकने लगता है.
Silk flourished in Varanasi between the 16th and 18th centuries, when the Mughal dynasty ruled over India. They were known for their lavish taste in architecture, food, and clothing. So weavers added real gold and silver threads into their silk garments. And only India's richest and most influential families could afford them. In the 19th century, more than 300,000 weavers worked across the city. But industrialization brought in power looms that produced faster and cheaper fabrics. Today, less than 15% remain in this traditional craft compared to its peak. These traditional fabrics are so festive that they're reserved for special occasions. In some communities, only brides wear them. The lightest sari will take about a week to weave. Heavier ones can take a month, and more intricate designs can take 6 months to complete. While Muhammad is able to only make 4 to 5 saris a month, a machine can finish a design in one day.
बनारसी साड़ी देखेगा तो खुद ही फर्क पड़ जाएगा, पावर लूम से इसके कपड़ा में फर्क पड़ जाएगा.
Saris can be expensive. Detailed and complicated designs can be sold for thousands of dollars. But fake Banarasi saris have flooded the market since the mid-1980s. They can sell for as low as 2,500 Indian rupees or $31. That's a quarter of what Muhammad charges for some of his cheaper saris. To compete, some business owners here in Varanasi are opting to use the machines too. And they've even started using synthetic yarns instead of real silk. A major hurdle is that it can be hard to tell the difference between the two.
ये देखिए, पावर लूम की देखिए जरी बैठा है, उतनी चमक नहीं आएगी. इतनी लैलून धागा से बना हुआ है. रेशम में चमक आता है, लैलून में चमक नहीं आएगा.
But Muhammad cannot afford the costs that come with the modernization of his craft. In 2009, the Indian government issued a geographical indication for Banarasi brocades and saris. That means only hand-loomed saris made in Varanasi and a few other districts can be branded authentic. But this did not stop the production of imitations and has not helped the traditional weavers.
सुबह सो के उठते नाश्ता होता है, काम में बैठ जाते रोजी के लिए.
The future of the hand-loomed fabric remains uncertain. But Muhammad believes that people who know the value of authentic Banarasi saris will continue to buy them.
ये बहुत पुराना सनत है, ये खत्म नहीं होगा. कम हो जाएगा पर चलता रहेगा हमेशा.
Bone carving can be traced back to prehistoric times. In India, artisans have been turning buffalo bones into works of art since at least the 16th century, when royals would commission works like this in ivory. But more recently, a scarcity of materials and legal restraints have pushed people away from the craft. We visited Lucknow, India, to see how one group of bone carvers is still standing. Jalaluddin Akhtar stores bones out on the roof of his home. He has enough stock to last him 6 months.
कभी खराब नहीं होती है. हम इसको अगर 100 साल रखेंगे तो 100 साल खराब नहीं होगी.
These were once widely available when traders sold them out of giant warehouses. But now, Jalaluddin has to get them from butchers instead. Down in the workshop, Jalaluddin cuts the bones into smaller pieces. He learned the art from his uncle in 1980. It's been in his family for over 50 years. And in his lifetime, he's seen the industry change.
देखिए पहले जो है जब हमने काम ये सीखा था तो बहुत अच्छा काम था. ये अभी इधर जो है 10 सालों में थोड़ा बहुत डाउन हो गया काम. इतना डाउन हो गया है कि समझ लीजिए कि 70% काम खत्म हो चुका है.
Jalaluddin chops down the bone to make it straight.
इसको काटते काटते हाथ में भी लग जाती है, अंगूठा कट जाता है.
He sells any excess fragments for 13 cents a pound to factories that grind them up and sell them as fertilizer. Then he shaves down the bone pieces with an electric sander.
इसको फ्लैट कर रहे हैं ताकि हमें एक दूसरे में चिपका सकें.
Electricity is expensive and sometimes unreliable in this part of India, so not all bone carvers can afford to run tools like these. The Akhtar family says that's part of the reason many have left the craft. These pieces will later be glued together to form a lampshade. But first, Jalaluddin needs to boil them with baking soda.
अब इसका हमें ऑयल निकालना है इसका जो है।
They cook for 3 hours.
पकने लगेगा करेंगे। जितना ऑयल था सब निकल गया है। अब इनको हम जो है सुखला रहे हैं छाही में, यानी पंखे के नीचे। अब ये सूख जाएंगे तो हमें ये एक दूसरे में ही चिपका देने हैं इस तरह से।
He files down the edges so that they align when he glues them together. In the past, there were workers who specialized in this step. But now, Jalaluddin has to do all the processes himself. Once the glue is dry, he drills tiny holes to create a piece called the net. He used to do this by hand, but the drill press has made the process much more efficient.
अब जो हमने ये किया है 5 मिनट में हमने किया है, अगर हम ये हाथ से करते तो कम से कम 20 मिनट लगते हैं इसको बनाने में।
Then he submerges the bones in hydrogen peroxide to clean them.
जैसे हमारे डॉक्टर वगैरह जो है जख्म साफ करते हैं।
Normally, the pieces lay out in the sun to whiten, but when it's rainy, Jalaluddin uses a light bulb instead.
अब ये 6 घंटे ये जो है चलता रहेगा, जलता रहेगा, और इसी गर्मी से जो है अंदर ये जितने पीसेस हैं हमारे सब वाइट हो जाएंगे।
He polishes each piece with this buffing machine. And then puts all the parts together to create the shape of a lamp. Some designs call for different tools, like this one. The artisans hand make it themselves.
तो हम लोग छाते की तीली से बनाते हैं। पहले छाते की तीली लाते हैं, उसको घिसते हैं, फिर उसमें दाने काटते हैं, फिर धार लगाते हैं, फिर एक लकड़ी का वो होता है बेटी, उसमें ठोक करके फिर वो जाके औजार तैयार होता है और उससे जाली बनती है।
Akhel is one of Jalaluddin's 3 sons. He's hand carving holes with the help of a wooden anvil.
समझिए बोन कार्विंग काम करने के लिए ये बहुत मेन चीज़ है। ये ना हो तो बोन कार्विंग काम बहुत होना मुश्किल हो जाएगा, बिकॉज इस पे ही सारे हाथ वाले काम होते हैं। जैसे कि
The block keeps the piece in place while workers carve. They used to fix the wooden blocks into the ground, but over time they started using a stone to weigh down the block instead.
अगर आप मिट्टी में ये चीज़ गाड़ते हो लकड़ी को तो उसको कहीं ले नहीं जा सकते हो। अब इसको क्या आप कहीं भी उठा के ले जा सकते हो।
Akhel learned the craft at 14 years old and won a state award at 18. But he wasn't always excited about the job.
पहले तो हमें लगता था कि बहुत मेहनत है, कि पापा लोग को देखते थे सुबह 6 बजे से काम करना शुरू कर देते थे, रात से 1 बजे तक काम ही क्या करते थे।
Now he sees potential in it.
ये ऐसा कोई एंड नहीं है, आप कुछ भी बना सकते हो। दिमाग चलाते रहें, इम्प्रूवमेंट करते रहें तो कुछ भी बना, तो कोई सीमा ही नहीं है, कुछ भी बनाते रहिए तो और मज़ा आता है करने में।
Akhel and his father work with just 1 or 2 other artisans who have different expertises. Salahuddin Beg's specialty is engraving.
ये सब मैं हाथ से ड्राइंग करता हूँ, कोई मेरे पास खाका नहीं है, कोई मेरे पास फरमा नहीं है। ये सब एक दूसरे से मोशन बना हुआ है, एक दूसरे को देख रहे हैं।
Many bone carving designs resemble architecture from the Mughal Empire. 18th century buildings still stand from when the Muslim dynasty ruled India. Back then, royals commissioned artisans to carve ivory to their liking. But when the ivory trade was banned in the 1990s, carving bones from camels or buffaloes became a legal and cheaper alternative. The Akhtar family says their business peaked during the early 2000s with support from the government. Jalaluddin won a national award in 2012. And a couple years later, the government sent him to Brazil to show off his work.
तो वहाँ पे जो है बहुत अच्छा है, यानी यहाँ से बहुत अच्छे पैसे वहाँ थे, कि जो चीज़ हम यहाँ 20 रुपए में बेचते थे तो वो चीज़ वहाँ 400 रुपए में खरीद रहे थे लोग शौक से।
But soon after, the Akhtar said with a new administration, funding shrunk, and business hasn't been the same ever since.
फिर उसके बाद में सरकार जब बदली फिर धीरे धीरे वो गिरता चला गया। आज वो दौर हो गया है कि अब समझिए 30% काम बचा है।
Then in 2017, the government put restrictions on slaughterhouses and forced many of them to shut their doors, cutting off artists' bone supply.
कम से कम यहाँ पे 5 से 6 कारखाने थे। अब वो धीरे धीरे करके एक कारखाना बचा, बाकी सब खत्म हो गए।
The raw materials became too expensive for such a small market. Some artisans went abroad for better work, and others didn't pass on the craft within their families.
अब धीरे धीरे तो ऐसे ही लगता है कि आगे चल कर के 10-20 साल के बाद क्या होने वाला है ये तो पता नहीं है।
Today, the Akhtar family teaches workshops to people in the community. It's part of the government's initiative to save the art. It pays for the students to attend the classes, and for the Akhtars to teach them.
बोन कार्विंग अगर आज थोड़ा बहुत बची भी है तो इसमें सरकार का बहुत योगदान है। अगर सरकार ने ज़रा भी इंटरेस्ट ना लिया होता तो शायद बोन कार्विंग ख़त्म हो गई होती।
And while the pandemic has slowed down classes and regular business, it's also given the Akhtars time to develop new designs, like this lamp. It sells for around 12,000 Indian rupees, or $200. They export most of their products to foreign customers. This is one of their most rare and expensive pieces. It's a perfume holder made from camel bone. They crafted it 30 years ago and just recently sold it for $1,200 to an art collector.
और इतना बड़ा प्रॉफिट हो नहीं पाता क्योंकि मार्केट भी कम है बोन कार्विंग की। ये इंडिया में अभी डिमांड कम है और ऑर्डर भी कम रहते हैं, इस वजह से थोड़ा सा दिक्कत आती है, इसीलिए बहुत सारे कारखाने बंद हो गए।
Akhil is hoping to start selling their work through social media.
फ्यूचर भी ऑनलाइन पे ही सारा, क्योंकि ज़्यादातर मार्केट ऑनलाइन आ चुकी है, तो हम अपने प्रोडक्ट को भी ऑनलाइन अपने लेवल पे धीरे धीरे ला रहे हैं, पर उम्मीद है कि सारे प्लेटफॉर्म पे इंशाल्लाह ज़रूर लाएंगे।
And the Akhtars don't plan on stopping anytime soon.
काम मैंने इसलिए सीखा बिकॉज ये जो आर्ट थी हमारी ये ख़त्म हो रही थी। कारीगर काम छोड़ चुके हैं, कुछ रिक्शा चला रहे हैं, कुछ क्या कर रहे हैं।
अब हम लोगों ने क्या किया है कि अब इसी में करते हैं, इसी में रोजी रोटी हमारी भाई यही है।
It takes nearly a week to make one Dhokra statue. Artisans build the mold from mud and spend hours handicrafting the intricate details using strings of beeswax. Eventually, all of this will be lost to make way for metal. Tribes in India have practiced this art for 4,500 years. Rajendra was just 10 years old when he started learning the craft.
वो चीज़ अगर कोई खरीद ले तो उसके लिए एक सोने पे सुहागा वाला सोना का चीज़ कोई खरीद लिया।
But many artisans were forced to quit when India rolled out a controversial economic reform that threatened their livelihoods.
तो कोरोना में फिर हमारे जो कौम के लोगों के पास में और कोई दूसरा व्यवसाय नहीं है।
Now, many are searching for more sustainable careers. We traveled to Chhattisgarh in India to see how this centuries-old tradition is still standing. Dhokra art is more than a job for Rajendra, it's a passion. And his workshop has been a staple in the town of Kondagao for over 10 years. He starts each day by mixing rice husk with black soil to make the clay. This blend keeps the model from cracking.
तो वो ये ढोकरा का काम में कई बार उन्होंने हमारे प्रोजेक्ट बना के फिर उसको देखे होंगे, तब जाके वो मिट्टी लोगों का चयन किए। और क्या पूरा काम हाथ से होता है और धीरे धीरे होता है।
He leaves it to dry in the sun for 2 days. This layer of wet riverbed soil helps smooth out any bumps. Then it's time to prepare the wax. Rajendra uses beeswax because it's strong and allows him to create intricate designs. He melts and strains it into cold water. The linen cloth catches impurities like bee wings. The fire makes the wax more pliable and easier to shape into logs. Rajendra adds it to this pressing machine he inherited from his grandfather. The press stretches the wax into meter-long strings. This was once done completely by hand. Some other communities still use that method, but it takes a lot of time.
एक अगर धागा 1 मीटर का धागा निकालना है तो कम से कम 15 मिनट 20 मिनट लगेगा.
Rajendra prepares the model for the wax, smoothing the surface with a file and rubbing it with a bean leaf.
रेत को हटाने के लिए वो पॉलिश का इस्तेमाल करते हैं जो सेम का पत्ती है.
Slowly, he wraps the strings around the model to bring his ideas to life. The design he makes with the wax is printed on the wet soil underneath. He has to be careful not to leave gaps between the strings.
धीरे से धीरे करके तो वो धागा टूटना नहीं चाहिए और जुड़ना नहीं चाहिए.
Designing is Rajendra's favorite part of the process. It took him years to master, and precision is key here. He can spend a full day working on just one sculpture. He comes up with his designs on a whim and improvises as he goes.
अच्छा लगता है मतलब कि वो काम करूं तो उसका वो ओके उसको वो जो भाव उस मूर्ति के अंदर लाना पड़ता है. हाथ से परफेक्ट नहीं होगा. सब चीज़ का सब प्रकार थोड़ा ना थोड़ा सब जगह डिफरेंस होगा. ढोकरा का खासियत वही है.
Most Dhokra sculptures depict animals and deities from tribal folklore.
ये पहला स्टेप तैयार हो गया. ऐसा ये नंदी तैयार हो जाता है. जैसे नंदी का पहला स्टेप हो गया.
Nandi is a sacred bull in Hindu culture and one of Rajendra's most popular designs. Many believe it brings peace and prosperity into the home. Rajendra has made hundreds of these sculptures over the years. He covers the model in another layer of soil. This method of creating 2 layers on both sides of the wax is called hollow casting. Rajendra makes 2 holes at the base that will allow the wax to melt and make way for the molten metal. He covers the model in another layer of termite soil and creates a funnel around the wax strip.
उस पाइप में पिघली हुई पीतल उसमें डाल देंगे तो जैसा जैसा मोम का अंदर बना हुआ है वैसा वैसा पीतल का रूप ले लेगा.
Rajendra starts a fire in this brick furnace and uses wood from a forest nearby. He monitors the temperature throughout, keeping it at around 1300 degrees. The model sits in the fire for 2 hours until all of the wax melts away. If it's too hot, the model will crack and spoil.
वो लाल होते जाएगा. पूरी लाल ईंट के सरीख लाल दिखेगा और मेटल पूरा मेल्ट हो जाएगा. तो हम लोगों को पता लग जाता है कि पक गया.
Rajendra removes it from the furnace with a metal rod.
तो हाथ बैठ जाता है. जब वो मॉडल को अपन लोहे के संसी से जब पकड़ते हैं तो वो अंडा की सरीख वो रहता है. लेकिन अपने को संसी कहाँ पकड़ना है किस जगह में तो वो पूरा काम मैनेजमेंट होता है.
He melts pieces of scrap metal, including utensils and old machine parts. Then he pours the molten mix into the channel and waits for it to cool down. Dhokra art gets its name from the Dhokra Damar, the nomadic tribe that popularized the craft across the country. Legend has it the tribe went from village to village, selling the metal figurines of Hindi gods and goddesses in exchange for food. The art form continued to thrive into the 2000s. But that all changed in 2016, when India demonetized much of its currency in an effort to weed out illegal money and counterfeit bills. Overnight, almost 90% of the cash in circulation was made worthless. Many customers stopped buying Dhokra art to save money. It took the Indian government 8 months to replace the bills in remote areas of Chhattisgarh. By the time it did, many Dhokra artists who depended on cash sales had to quit the craft to make a living.
भाई हमारे पास बजट नहीं है, पैसा है ही नहीं, मार्केट में पैसा है ही नहीं, ऐसा करके.
While Dhokra is still popular, many artisans are still struggling. So Rajendra recognizes the importance of his work every time he breaks a mold and reveals his newest creations.
ये सही सलामत बनेगा क्योंकि जैसे माँ का कोख में बच्चा रहता है वैसी है कि जब तक बाहर नहीं निकलेगा तब तक हमको मालूम नहीं रहता है कि पूरा बन गया कि खराब हो गया.
The rising cost of raw materials is forcing them to sell their sculptures at higher prices. The number of artisans working in the trade has dropped by nearly a third in the last 3 decades.
कि अब ये काम नहीं चलेगा, कौन खरीदेगा, ये तो कोई खाने पीने का चीज़ नहीं है, एक बार बन गया तो 100 साल तक चल रहा है, तो कहाँ से चलेगा, ऐसा भी कई हमारे शिल्पियों का मन में आता है भावना, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है.
But it's not just about the money for Rajendra. His uncle Jaidev Baghel was recognized as a master Dhokra craftsman by the Indian government and even earned a statue in Kondegao for his work.
वो सारे काम को वो अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मार्केट तक पहुंचा चुके हैं.
Now, Rajendra is continuing his legacy. He's trained over 200 people and helps them sell their work. Despite the hardships, he's managed to keep his business afloat. He sells mainly in government-funded showrooms and makes around 40,000 rupees or $500 a month. He's shown his work in exhibits across India and has won 2 national awards.
तो इस काम को पकड़ के किया तो वो मैं उस राष्ट्रपति के साथ खाना खाया, प्रधानमंत्री के साथ खाना खाया, बैठा, घूमा, देश दुनिया में गया, तो जो चीज़ मेरे को मिला तो वो चीज़ मेरे पूर्वज का देन है.
But that's not the reality for most small-scale artisans who make around 7,000 rupees a month, less than half the monthly average for most workers. And many Dhokra-making families are encouraging their kids to work different jobs.
इसमें लोग अभी भी हारने की कोशिश में हैं, लोग डर रहे हैं अभी.
Rajendra believes his traditions molded him, and he wants to do the same for future generations.
अभी तो हम लोग एक सिटी भर जगह में तक हमारा सामान नहीं पहुंचेगा. हम तो एक छोटे से गांव में 100 लोग हैं. मेरे ढोकरा का आर्ट तो एक तो मेरा खानदानी काम है, मेरे लिए तो बहुत गर्व का बात है. फिर मैं पढ़ा लिखा नहीं हूँ तो मेरे लाइफ के लिए तो बहुत बड़ा महत्व है कि मैं ढोकरा आर्ट ही करता रहूँगा और करता ही चला रहूँगा और आगे बढ़ाऊँगा इसको.
Papermaking has been the heart of this Indian town's economy for at least 5 centuries. And a lot of the work is done by hand, 1 sheet at a time. This factory can make 10,000 sheets in just a day. But in a modern world full of automated paper mills, how is a 500-year-old industry still standing? The work at Kalpana Handmade Papers in Sanganer starts with waste. The workshop recycles scraps from garment factories that would otherwise be thrown away. Nimi Chand Saini is the owner and oversees every step of the process.
इसमें जो दिख रहा है आपको ये छलनी है, इसमें कोई मिट्टी के कण हो या इसमें कोई कचरा हो तो कचरा हम निकाल रहे हैं इससे.
Bigger pieces go through this shredding machine. Within seconds, a pile of pulverized fabric comes out the other end. Workers dump over 200 pounds of shredded fabric and paper into this tank. One batch takes 1,500 liters of water. The mixing used to be done entirely by hand, which took triple the amount of time as it does today. Now, the machine can turn out pulp in under 2 hours. Then, it's time for the most crucial step, turning the pulp into paper. This skill requires years of training.
इसी का जो सबसे मेन ये चीज़ सीखे हुए कारीगर होते हैं, उनको सिखाया जाता है. सिखाने के बाद में ही कर पाते हैं ये. नहीं ये जो है बिल्कुल इनको हर आदमी के लिए मुश्किल है.
It takes 2 people to spread the pulp evenly onto the sieve. The amount varies depending on how thick the paper will be.
सबसे बड़ा मुश्किल काम यही है, इसको जो बिल्कुल अपने स्ट्रेट रखना. ये पर शीट वेट के हिसाब से होती है, तो इस पल्प के नाप से ये डाल रहे हैं अकॉर्डिंग उसके कि जितनी थिकनेस हमको चाहिए.
A piece of cloth goes on top of the pulp so that the sheets don't stick together. For specialty paper, workers add extra decorations, like these rose petals. They do this 1,000 times until the batch is complete. Then, the stack goes into the hydraulic press.
पहले सर इस पे क्या होता था कि हम इसके ऊपर कुछ लकड़ी का फंटा लगा करके इस पे कुछ वेट रख करके और उस फिर पानी निकालने के बाद में फिर क्या होता था कि इसको हम दीवारों पे चिपका के पेपर को.
Now they use heavy machinery to press the stack and send it to the upper level where there's sunlight. They remove each piece of cloth one by one, so it can be reused in another batch.
ये फट करके खराब नहीं हो जाएगा तब तक हम इसको यूज करते रहेंगे.
The sheets hang out to dry for 2 days. Then a machine called a calendar smooths out each piece.
ये चद्दर है लोहे की, इसके बीच में ये दोनों रोल के बीच में जाएगा मशीन में.
Workers say that the paper's texture changes drastically after this process. Finally, with the help of a giant paper cutter, the worker slices stacks of paper down to size. The scraps will make their way back into the process from the beginning. Paper-making communities called Khagsis came to India around the 16th century and eventually settled in the town of Sanganer. A nearby river made it the perfect place for making paper. But when the British came to power in the 1800s, they started importing paper from mills abroad. The local workshops that made paper by hand couldn't compete, and many closed down. Mahatma Gandhi stepped in during the 1940s during his fight for Indian independence. He advocated for local handicrafts and is credited today with saving the handmade paper industry. Even though this factory's process has modernized with some machines, the sheet-by-sheet technique sets it apart from most mass-produced paper.
हाथ से जो बनाया वो पेपर है उसमें एक अलग लुकिंग अलग उसकी जो एक डिज़ाइन उस पेपर की एक अलग ही देखने को मिलती है जो कि मिल मेड से अलग हट करके है.
They ship all over the world and use the paper to make hundreds of different products. About 40 employees design things like calendars, jewelry boxes.
तो आप इस बॉक्स को जैसे देखेंगे तो इसमें जो बाहर हम कार्डबोर्ड यूज़ कर रहे हैं वो दैट इज़ अ रिसाइकल्ड कार्डबोर्ड और अंदर जो आप पेपर देख रहे हैं इट इज़ अ हैंडमेड पेपर.
And ornaments.
क्रिसमस ट्री पे जैसे डेकोरेट करें तो ये पूरा इको फ्रेंडली प्रोडक्ट है.
The workers here take pride in their craft.
सबसे बड़ी बात यह है कि एक ये वेस्ट चीज़ से हम इस पेपर को तैयार कर रहे हैं. कोई बहुत हमको गर्व महसूस होता है कि हम अपने हाथ से जो है एक हाथ की कोई चीज़ बना करके और हम उसको मार्केट में उतार रहे हैं.
And as long as people need paper, Nimi is confident his business will thrive.
हैंडमेड पेपर की जो हाथ से बनाई हुई चीज़ है और इसकी लुकिंग जो है वो एक अलग पहचान है. इस वजह से इसको रखना चाहते हैं. इसकी डिमांड है मार्केट में. इसका बहुत ही अच्छा ब्राइट फ्यूचर है. ये एक हर आदमी की यूज़ की एक चीज़ है.
Every morning at sunrise, Kashmiri farmers gather at Srinagar's famous floating market on Dal Lake. Muhammad Sadiq Khan paddles half a mile to get there from his home to the other side of the water. Just a decade ago, Muhammad would have met up with hundreds of other sellers. These days, though, there are just a few dozen left. Most of their families have traded here for generations. Srinagar's floating market has survived decades of conflict, political upheaval, and natural disasters. But today, the lake itself is at risk. Sewage dumping and pollution are suffocating the waters farmers depend on. We went to Dal Lake in Indian-administered Kashmir to find out how this floating market is still standing.
Ç gol nemada pemada paran patneran market şabajı. Kardeşler. Swadesh ya. Paduva market gas 5 pet.
Roughly 60,000 people depend on Dal Lake for their livelihoods. Many work in tourism and fishing. But the lake's agriculture is one of its most important industries. On this cold winter morning, Muhammad picks up collard greens to sell.
Koşuş sabzı best. İbayne koyun.
What makes them unique is how they're grown. People began farming inside the lake centuries ago. Over time, generations of farmers passed down their methods.
What was this? I just got asked beautiful path Peter, Peter, but it's but I think mission I still I'm a poor Pakna.
These floating gardens are called rad in Kashmiri. Some grow naturally, others are artificial. Farmers weave together wetland plants and bring up the roots and soil from the bottom of the lake to layer into what is essentially a floating mat. They plant collard leaves, turnips, carrots, and other produce. But the market's most popular crop actually grows under the water. The lotus root, locally known as nadru, is used in many Kashmiri dishes. And Dal Lake is considered one of the region's best producers.
ये जो चीज़ से टेस्ट पसंद क्या क्या है पब्लिक का इशू करोड़ बंदों का इशू क्या नहीं क्या
The floating market runs every day for 2 hours, even in the dead of winter. Farmers wear an iconic woolen overcoat called a peran to keep warm. They share a traditional Kashmiri green tea called kahwa that's mixed with cinnamon, cardamom, and saffron. And they wait for shopkeepers who travel from the city to buy their vegetables. It's a ritual that has been going on for at least 100 years.
ये मार्केट को मैं पुराने आसाने शुरू ऐसा पाई
Floating markets like this one were once a central part of life across Asia. They date back to the 14th century, but most still around today are less than 200 years old. They popped up in places like Vietnam, Thailand, and parts of India, where rivers, wetlands, and coastlines were the main routes for transporting people and goods. So trading on the water made a lot of sense. But as infrastructure improved and roads were built in these areas, vendors started to move their goods by land. By the mid-20th century, floating markets throughout Asia became tourist attractions, like Dal Lake's market. Visitors filled the hundreds of houseboats lining the lake. They'd take rides in small boats called shikaras to get an up-close look at the floating market. By the 1980s, tourism became a thriving industry.
यद बनो टूरिस्ट आना ज़्यादा वो बना एक शिकारी मुझे ना शिकारियन मैं जो शूटिंग में वो था बच्चा था खानर करने वो या पूरे सा पत्ते रहा शुमन बड़ा
But Kashmir lies on a political and religious fault line, and that has made it hard to keep attracting visitors. India and Pakistan began to fight over the territory after they gained independence from British rule in 1947. Unrest flared up again in the 1990s, and fighting between separatists and Indian security forces drove most tourists away. Despite ongoing conflict, farmers here kept growing and selling produce from their boats every morning for decades. But in 2014, devastating floods brought everything to a halt for the first time in the market's history.
It was sorry, Abu. It was Abu because my makan pe aamute tha.
Dal Lake was virtually deserted. The market stopped,
तल गो अम गो आब तक खराब ये नदर जमीन यह गो अम खराब.
It took farmers months to recover. Eventually, more than a year later, things began to pick up again. But as Srinagar's population grew, so did its environmental problems. By the 1980s, locals were complaining about the sewage being dumped from hundreds of houseboats. Studies show they're one of the lake's biggest polluters.
Imi aban kar sabzi kharab. Acha houseboat worthy lettering, but worthy lettering, soil se lettering ge lettering. Amsi ke sabzi kharab. And go pollution andar. Zameen go kharab.
But that's just one part of a massive waste problem. The government admitted that more than 44 million liters of sewage from the city was being dumped into the lake every day. That's enough to fill more than 17 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
Tamam water lagavan. Aaj bane su karun kiya.
The government announced it would connect all houseboats to sewage plants last year. It banned plastic on the lakeshore and ordered mechanical dredgers to scoop out invasive weeds and other kinds of waste. But even a cleaned up Dal Lake would still face yet another challenge.
Lokat bache paran. Nimchani lai karam kiske. Nimche parne kis payas.
Mohammed says farming hasn't been profitable enough to entice the next generation. In fact, some vegetables cost him more to grow than what he can sell them for. And competition has grown fierce.
It was a rush. It bani pinchumudi to let fuck. Tachiwan gamatan hun mal. Load kare kya red and kya garden kya.
It's why many farmers are unsure about the future of the market. Some have left farming or work other jobs just to get by.
Urbaza jakat pishus filali ay kam karan. Bot es karan misal gar se boz da dashwe se sin karan. आज आए वन थोड़ा गरीबी थी अच्छी नहीं वन खास कहीं.
Mohammed makes just enough to care for himself and his wife Salima Jan. But he refuses to let that discourage him. He has hope that the lake, its floating gardens, and the market will survive.
वक्त वाज यार साफ फर्स्ट क्लास साफ अन्ना बंद फिलहाल पता नहीं खुदा वानी करी खुदा से अच्छा सो रहे.
The palm of the hand is the essential tool for getting this painting technique just right. Rogan Art is a centuries-old craft, and it's been in Abdul Ghaffur Khatri's family for 8 generations. These designs were once popular throughout India, but the rise of industrial textiles forced many artisans to leave the craft for more lucrative work. Today, the Khatri family members say they're the only Rogan artists left in the world.
परंपरा है हमारी तय दादाजी पिताजी और चाचा जी वगैरह तो हमारी पीढ़ी दर पीढ़ी ये कला चली आ रही है.
But the COVID-19 pandemic is now threatening their business. We take a look at how one family has left this tradition still standing. It all starts with castor oil. It's the base of the paint, and it's what gives the art its name. Rogan means oil in Farsi. Ghaffur's cousin, Mohammed, heats the oil for 2 days until it becomes a honey-like texture. It's a dangerous process only a few can handle.
4-5 kg जो ऑयल होता है उसमें कभी भी फायर हो सकता है तो ये बहुत डेंजर भी है और इस प्रोसेस के लिए हमारे सभी परिवार के लोग मास्टर नहीं है.
Once it's cooled, Ghaffur's nephew Jabbar combines it with pigment to create the paint.
उसको पत्थर के ऊपर रगड़ के पानी से थोड़ा भिगो के ग्राइंड करके रोगन उसमें वो भी अंदाजे से मिलाया जाता है. ऐसा नहीं कि 100 ग्राम रोगन है 50 ग्राम वो ऐसा नहीं अंदाजे से वो कूटते हैं दूसरे पत्थर से वो रंग और रोगन एक हो गया.
Then it's time to paint. Ghafoor says it's the use of the hand that gives Rogan Art its unique quality.
अगर कटोरी से डायरेक्ट उस कलम को कलर से उठाया तो डायरेक्ट आप उसका तार नहीं बना सकते क्योंकि बहुत थिक रहता है। अभी उसको हाथ पे रख के इस कोने पे रख के हमको रगड़ना है।
Swirling the paint into his palm creates heat to thin it out. Then, Ghafoor floats the thread of paint over the fabric using a metal rod. He runs his other hand underneath the cloth to guide the paint. He has an idea of the final design in his mind, but the painting process is completely freehand.
जो पूरा तार इसका परफेक्ट जो चल सकेगा, कितना खींचेगा, वो सब आर्टिस्ट के दिमाग में रहता है। ये सब गॉड गिफ्ट है, कुल मिला के गॉड गिफ्ट है। ये हर किसी की बस की बात नहीं है, न किसी मशीन का काम है इस चीज़ के लिए।
Before it dries, Ghafoor folds the cloth to print the design's mirror image. He can finish some pieces in 5 days, while more complex designs can take him up to 2 years.
इसमें जो बारीकी है, ये येलो कलर की, वो एक एक बिंदी से कलम की पॉइंट से रखी गई है, जिसके लिए बहुत समय जाता है और ये खास अपने आप में खास इसलिए माना जाता है।
Wall art pieces like this one can cost over $1,000. Ghafoor and his family normally sell their pieces to tourists, but the pandemic put a strain on their peak season.
और अभी तक तो ये बता सकते हैं कि पूरा लॉस में ही है, क्योंकि टूरिस्ट नहीं आए तो ये बिजनेस टूरिस्ट के ऊपर जो डिपेंड हैं और तो कोई सोर्स है नहीं, तो क्या करना। अभी हम बैठे हैं, राह देखते हैं क्या होने वाला है, क्या होगा, क्या करना है।
The struggle feels familiar. The art is said to have come to India from Persia 400 years ago, and it was once popular on bedding and ceremonial clothing here in India. But with the rise of mass-produced textiles in the 80s, locals lost interest in these more expensive, handmade pieces. Many artisans couldn't compete with mass manufacturers and dropped their crafts to find other work. Ghafoor, too, made the hard decision to leave the family business and look for work in Mumbai.
पहले बताया कि 1980 के आसपास मैंने तय कर लिया था कि मैं इस कला में अपना जीवन बर्बाद नहीं करूँगा, और हमारा थोड़ा बहुत इस बात से थोड़ा ये भी हुआ परिवार के सामने, क्योंकि उस समय गांव का कोई लड़के को वहाँ तक मुंबई तक भेजना वगैरह तो वो बहुत बड़ी चीज़ लगती थी, मैं समझता हूँ।
But a sense of responsibility and a plea from his family brought him back.
और तू नहीं आया तो ये पीढ़ी बंद होगी, आगे नहीं चलेगी। और मुझे याद है उस समय मैंने उनसे ये वादा भी किया था कि अभी मैं पूरी लाइफ इसी कला के पीछे लगा दूंगा और दुनिया भर में कोशिश करूंगा कि दुनिया भर में इस कला का नाम हो। मैं ये भी बता सकता हूँ कि वो वादा अभी पूरा हो गया।
Since then, Ghafoor has brought Rogan Art to the international level. He's earned over 10 awards for his work, and India's Prime Minister gifted one of his pieces to President Barack Obama in 2014. And just as Ghafoor learned from his elders, now his nephew is determined to carry on the legacy.
हाँ, मतलब जैसे मैंने पहली बार ट्राई किया तो थोड़ा डिफ़िकल्ट लगा, फिर जब धीरे धीरे स्टेप बाय स्टेप हमको सीखने को मिला तो तभी जाके मतलब नहीं, ये एक बहुत बड़ी विरासत है हमारी फैमिली को और इसको हमें बचा के रखनी चाहिए।
He's committed to preserving Rogan art through education and social media.
वो ज़रूरी है, और इसलिए कि क्योंकि हमारे जैसे फैमिली मेम्बर लिमिटेड है 10 लोग, तो हम अभी ट्रेनिंग भी दे रहे हैं कि लोगों को थोड़ा नॉलेज मिले कि यार इतना रेयर है।
Before the pandemic, the Khatri family ran workshops. Since 2010, they've trained around 300 women, and 20 of them went on to work for the family. But when COVID-19 started to spread in March, business slowed and Ghafoor couldn't afford to keep them employed. Still, the family stays relevant with new products like face masks, and they have big plans to expand the business.
तो हम ये भी चाहते हैं कि कोई 2-3 डिज़ाइनर हो ऐसे इंडिया से या बाहर से कहीं पे भी जो हमारी हेल्प करे डिज़ाइनिंग में, ताकि हम उसको और ज़्यादा एक्सप्लोर कर सकते हैं आउट ऑफ इंडिया।
Though sales might be slow until tourists can start visiting again, Ghafoor believes he knows what it takes to be successful.
इस कला के लिए तो पेशेंस ही पेशेंस चाहिए, लेकिन इस कला को सेल के लिए भी पेशेंस रखना पड़ता है।
It can take almost a full year to make just one of these carpets. And a thorough wash is one of the last steps.
अगर इसमें थोड़ी सी भी अगर लापरवाही, अगर थोड़ी सी भी अगर असावधानी हो तो पूरा कार्पेट जो है रुइन हो जाएगा.
They're made by Obiti, India's largest producer of handmade carpets. It makes roughly 350,000 carpets a year. And almost all of them go to the US. It supplies brands like Williams-Sonoma and West Elm. One carpet can cost over $12,000. That's because weavers make most of them by hand, not by knot.
हर वक्त जब तक काम में लगे रहें तब तक ध्यान उसी पर रहे, कहीं दूसरा नहीं. दूसरा हुआ तो गड़बड़.
Obiti can reject a carpet for one small mistake, spoiling up to a year of work.
होती कभी-कभी दिन तो लोग लापरवाही बरत देते हैं तो बहुत परेशानी होती है.
So how does Obiti ensure perfection along the way? And how did this region become the carpet belt of India? Obiti is 103 years old, but people have been weaving carpets across South Asia since at least the 16th century. That's when Mughal Emperor Akbar brought Persian weavers here to make carpets for his palaces. Many settled in what's now the Mirzapur Bhadohi region in modern-day India. Today, over 3 million people here work in the carpet industry.
ये समझें कि हमारी ज़िंदगी तो इसी के साथ है और बहुत अच्छा ही लगा.
Obiti recently made 35,000 square feet of hand-knotted carpets for India's new parliament building in New Delhi. It took 900 weavers and over 1 million hours of work. The company dyes all its yarn in-house. Workers load up machines that can hold up to 880 pounds of yarn. The batch first goes through a chemical wash. Then they prepare the dyes, which are made from chemicals and natural ingredients like fruits and bark. Obiti takes a sample to the lab and runs a series of tests to make sure the color won't rub off. Weavers can't get started until they have the map, or naksha, which they have to follow in granular detail. Each square represents a knot and a specific yarn color. The company has its own weaving center with 224 artisans. Weavers here use a drum to build the carpet's foundation, or warp. But some build it by hand, which can take a full day.
हम लोग इसी के ताना जब करने शुरू करते हैं तो बड़ी सावधानी से, एक भी तागा इसका गड़बड़ ना हो.
Obiti works with over 25,000 local weavers, like Ramlal. He's been working with the company for about 50 years.
हम सब दिन जब से कार्य शुरू किया तो यही, फिर दूसरा काम हमको अच्छा ही नहीं लगा.
Once the warp is done, he starts laying down the design, thread by thread.
नक्शे के सामने हमेशा देखना पड़ता है सर.
Some of these have over 2 million knots.
16 घंटे भी चल रहा है, 18 घंटे भी चल रहे थे तो शरीर बहुत ज़्यादा थक जाता है. तब तो ऐसा लगता है कि रेस्ट, कुछ समय रेस्ट हो जाए.
And one costly mistake could ruin the whole thing.
एक दो बार होता है तो उखाड़ लेते हैं, नहीं तो कारपेट ख़राब हो जाता है. कंपनी वाले से तो बहुत दिक्कत करें, बहुत दिक्कत होती. कभी-कभी दिन तो लोग लापरवाही बरत देते हैं तो बहुत परेशानी होती है.
Company officials inspect the work on each one of Obiti's 5,000 looms every 15 days. Once each carpet is finished and approved, weavers deliver it to the factory. But the work isn't done yet. Workers use a blowtorch to burn off loose fibers. Then, teams of washers give the carpet a scrub. Everything starts with a water dousing. A chemical treatment gets rid of dust.
जो ये लोग होते हैं ये काफ़ी एक्सपर्ट होते हैं. अगर इसमें थोड़ी सी भी अगर लापरवाही, अगर थोड़ी सी भी अगर असावधानी हो और थोड़ी सी भी अगर लथार्जीनेस जिसको बोल सकते हैं अगर कोई करे तो पूरा कार्पेट जो है रुइन हो जाएगा. क्योंकि इसमें जो कॉटन होता है वो जो है अगर ब्लीचिंग अगर थोड़ी सी अगर रह जाए, प्रॉपर क्लीनिंग ना हो तो वापस जो है ये डैमेज कर सकता है कॉटन को.
Carpets shrink during the washing phase, so they have to be stretched back out once they're dry. Then, the workers clip and shear the carpet's surface to a specific height. Machines help, but they mostly have to do this by hand. They also straighten and bind its edges, and trim or knot any fringes. After 2 more rounds of inspection, the carpets are ready for delivery. It takes hundreds of workers to keep this operation going. But the company has struggled to find new weavers. Uttar Pradesh is one of India's poorest states, and young people are moving away to find better paying jobs.
रूरल एरिया में जहाँ पे ऐसे सबको लगता है कि हाँ रूरल एरिया में हम लोगों के पास मैन पावर्स जो है अबंडेंट होते हैं, लेकिन ऐसी बात नहीं है.
Many of OBT's weavers are also farmers.
कभी कभी तो ऐसा होता है कि अगर 2 चीन का समय है, अभी सूर्य नहीं छिपा है, उजाला है, तो 2 चीन बीन लें.
OBT has been trying to boost its workforce by recruiting more women. The Indian carpet industry has been predominantly male for centuries, and this has been a trend across industries. Last year, only about 25% of working-age women in India were part of the labor force. Veteran weavers like Ramlal have trained almost 2,000 women since 2015. And they're keeping standards high.
दूसरा हुआ तो गड़बड़ हो. ये सीख है, सीख लेंगे तो उन्हें बहुत काम पड़ेगा. इस गलीचे से हमने अपनी पूरी ज़िंदगी का बच्चों को पढ़ाया लिखाया, इन्हीं से खिलाया, इसी से ब्याह शादी किया. हमारे यहाँ ये चलता रहे क्योंकि हमारे दादा लोगों की ये दी हुई अमानत है.